Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It's Saturday, July 21st, and we are going to spend some time talking about the entrance of the sun into the sign of Leo, as well as a powerful kind of T-square configuration that's coming up between the sun, Mars, and Uranus, which is culminating in the next week with a great big lunar eclipse in the sign of Aquarius. So there's a lot to look at with this transit. You have four planets getting together, if you count Jupiter, which is widely involved, and a major lunar eclipse conjoined with Mars, which is retrograde right now. So yeah, there's definitely a lot going on. Before I keep going, someone's mentioning that there is an audio problem. Can others hear me okay? I'll type into the box. Can you guys hear me all right? Let's see here. I'll wait until I get confirmation from someone in the chat box there that you can hear me before I keep going. Let's just make sure. Oh, funny. Okay, you can hear me and see me. Okay, good. All right, great. Thank you, guys. So we'll just go ahead then. So our agenda today is to talk about the sun's entrance into the sign of Leo. What does that mean? What does that look like? And why do we say the things that we say about Leo? Like, well, Leos love to be the center of attention, or Leos are loyal and generous, or what have you. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we are going to move along to talking about the sun's entrance into Leo. It's immediate square to Uranus. It's closing in on an opposition to Mars, which will also culminate in the full moon lunar eclipse on the 27th. So we want to talk about all of those things today. So let's start off by talking about the sign of Leo. So with every sign of the zodiac, there are a series of things that we tend to say in modern astrology about each sign. And it's a good place to start with any sign. What do we say about Leo? We say, well, Leos are generous. They're, big-hearted. They're maybe sometimes a little grandiose or theatrical. A Leo likes to be center of attention, or the Leo likes the spotlight, or what have you. We say Leos are kingly or queenly. They're regal. They carry an aura of self-importance or pride. So these are some of the sort of stereotypical things that you hear people say about Leo. But where do these things come from? Is it the relationship of Leo to the sun? Is it the relationship of Leo to the element of fire, or to the fact that it's coming during the middle of a season and it's what we call a fixed or solid sign? All of these different factors may play a role, but one of the things I like to focus on, especially in the classes that I teach, and I just taught this actually last week to a new group of students, is some of the seasonal symbolism of the zodiac, and how the seasonal archetypes are really at the core, in my opinion, of why we end up saying what we say about the signs. So, for example, we have to take a look at what's happening throughout the entire course of the solar year to get a real feeling for each sign. So from the time of the winter solstice, which begins with the sign of Capricorn, all the way up to the summer solstice, the sun is basically, the arc of the ecliptic is climbing, growing higher in the sky. And so that means the days are getting longer. And so we say from the winter solstice forward, the days are getting longer, the light is growing. At the spring equinox moment, there's a moment where there's a kind of equal amount of light and dark in the 24-hour period. And then after the spring equinox, the light takes over. And from the spring equinox all the way to the fall equinox, we're in the light half of the year, season of spring and summer. When the light reaches the summer solstice, the arc is sort of highest in the sky, which means we have the longest day. It takes the sun the longest amount of time to go from the east all the way to the west. And so that just happened around June 20th or so. Every year, it's roughly the same time. And then from there, what starts happening, like just the inverse qualities compared to the winter solstice is that we see the sun now beginning to sink in the sky every day. The arc of the ecliptic path of the sun is coming down in the sky, and the days are getting shorter, little by little by little. Now, what's happening, that begins with the sign of Cancer. So in the sign of Cancer, you have the beginning of the descent of the solar year. And we talked about this at the beginning of Cancer season, what that represents. For example, Cancer is often related to the need for emotional security. Why do we say this about Cancer? Well, part of the reason that we say that the sign of Cancer has to do with emotional security is because because of some of the metaphors that we use surrounding light and darkness. So at the summer solstice, we've reached the maximum amount of light, and now we're descending away from it. At that time of the longest day of the year, where there's the most amount of light in the 24-hour period, the sun is also highest in the north that it will get, closest to the pole star, this sort of beacon of light and truth, and it's unmoving and it's unchanging. It's a sort of a symbol for eternity. So the sun has gotten closest to that pole star and is now descending away from it, down in the sky. The light's losing. So as soon as you begin to descend or decline away from the ideal source, the ideal divine sort of unchanging symbol of the pole star, and the light starts waning in the solar year, you're talking about separation, and you're talking about the descent of spirit into matter. As soon as that starts happening, the question in this material realm that we start living with, for example, as soon as we come out of our mother's womb, is how do I get back to that source? We see little children looking for that source, and they go to their mother's breast right away when they're born. And from then on, as we grow older, in many ways, our whole life, therapists have told us this for a long time. Freud and Jung talked about this. We look for that sense of connection to the womb, the connection to the great mother, the connection to our birth mothers, or that sense of being at home in the world, which Cancer so represents in all of these different ways, whether it's cooking food or being domestic or emotional nurturance. A lot of the stereotypes related to Cancer all have to do with trying to remain connected to that source, that the womb of life. Okay, so that comes from, is intimately connected to the fact that Cancer begins as the separation or descent from the light begins. So the light is a metaphor, you could say, for our divine source, our mother's womb, a feeling of connection and of being in the heart, a feeling of being in the soul. Cancer, as a sign that's initiating summer, is also initiating the separation from that at-homeness. And so its essence has something to do with looking for reconnection to it, remembering it, calling it to mind, holding it close. And that's kind of at the core of some of the seasonal symbolism of Cancer as it descends away from the pole star and the days start to get shorter. So that brings us to Leo. When we get to Leo, what are we dealing with? Well, the light is still descending, but now you have the most solid portion of summer. So in other words, what is the middle of summer like? It's most consistently, it's most consistently and most stably summer. I don't know if that makes sense, but like for example, at the beginning of summer, there's still spring-like qualities in the air mingling as summer is being initiated. But when you get into the middle of summer, what's happening is the days are stabilizing. So you're getting into this feeling of the same kind of the deepening of the dog days of summer, you might call them. Even though Leo's a cat, we'll say, lion, we'll say the dog days of summer. And dog days of summer can even kind of extend into Virgo. It just gets kind of like, oh, let me get done with summer. But that sense of you're in the depth of summer now. There's something solid, stabilizing, consistent. So when you juxtapose the seasonal quality of the kind of enduring, stable, consistent qualities of summer, along with which is the lightest, warmest time of the year, by the way, right? And in a sense, we have our time when the sun is sort of the solar qualities are sort of at their peak, the middle of summer. But when you pair that next to decline, when you pair that next to the fact that the sun is going down every day, that's where you get to some of the inner secrets of Leo. Because, for example, what is Leo really interested in the spotlight for? Why does Leo crave the spotlight so much? Or let's say, why is Leo so generous? Or why does Leo tend to embody itself in terms of leaders or famous people or like that? Well, here's one way of thinking about it. The interest for Leos is in legacy, because the Leo time of year reflects the fact that death is at hand, that inevitably your light will be lost, and inevitably the darkness will come. This reality is sinking in more and more as the sun is sinking every day, and yet it's an enduring and stabilizing time. So you think about the descent of light into darkness or spirit into matter, and you think of the inevitability of chaos, of death, of entropy, of the loss of light, of disintegration, of decline. Those realities are settling in, and yet there's something stabilizing in the midst of it. That's where legacy comes in. The idea of legacy is basically that I have a special reason to live here that's bigger than me. How do we know? Where do we get that sense of having to live for something that's bigger, that's more important, that's sort of grand or noble or elevated? We get that specifically from the fact that we will die someday, and yet that we have a feeling that our life is significant beyond our death, beyond the mere physical fact of decline, disintegration, and death. There is significance for being here. And the idea behind Leo is to sort of stabilize and fix a sense of the importance, specialness, beauty, grandness, regality of one's role or one's destiny in life, despite in the face of the inevitable death and decline of the solar year, of the body. So when you think, for example, about great leaders, right? Think of, now I don't want to get into politics here, but think of Barack Obama, who is a Leo sun. Barack Obama was someone who embodied the spirit of hope and had this kind of sense that he was bigger than life, and that what he was living for and his legacy and the nation's legacy, he carried that sense of there being an enduring and eternal reason for doing what you're doing. Even if, sometimes it's theatrical or, it's more of a show than a reality. People can debate those things about his life, I'm sure. He's still a human. But everyone, in a sense, there was so much hype and excitement about Barack Obama, a good Leo sun, because he gave people that sense of there being something transcendental or something bigger than us that we live for, and that we gain hope from that. So Leos are said to be encouraging. Leos are said to be encouraging because when you live for something bigger than yourself, you exude a kind of confidence in the eternal value of life, and you spread that to people naturally, like a sun, like a radiant sun. But on the other hand, of course, that can devolve into a simple desire to be famous, or desire to have a legacy of fame and self-importance, and can be kind of narcissistic. On the other hand, think about the history of how kings and queens were treated by people, or even different kinds of rulers or chieftains, or even certain kinds of celebrities. They're treated as gods, or they're treated as God in a more singular sense. Why is that? Why did that ever come about? Well, because the natural tendency of people without some kind of organizational transcendent principle within the civilization is toward chaos, is toward entropy. That's the idea anyway that's somewhat inherent within Leo. In other words, you need in Leo land, you need a king or a queen. Like you have a sun around which all of the planets orbit, you need a king or a queen to hold a position that symbolizes or becomes emblematic of the divine, the eternal, and that which is transcendent, around which the entire society can be organized, around which the meaning and cohesion of the vast array of diversity and differences can congeal into something more unified. So the other thing that's important about Leo is that having a special sense of purpose, a special sense of pride, a special sense of dignity, this also is something that grants a kind of sanity, or it grants a kind of cohesion and unity to our endeavors and our activities in our life. It grants a stability of spirit and mind. And in society long ago, divine dispensation and the rule of kings and queens that were thought of as the incarnation of God, set aside for a moment how corrupt the whole thing can get. Its ideal is that in a Leonic sense, having something at the center that represents God as an organizing principle creates cohesion and unity amongst the city, amongst the people, amongst the nation. We still have presidents here, even if we don't have, even if we don't have kings any longer. Presidents are still important. We know how important the role of a president is and how much like a good or bad king a president can be. Just look at the news any day now, right? Or if you think about this, just to use a specific example, during the daytime in ancient astrology, the daytime sect of planets were considered to be in power. So for example, the sun is the ruler of the daytime sect of planets. For an obvious reason, it's the brightest object of the daytime sky. Mars was considered, on the other hand, to be a planet that was called the malefic, contrary to the sect in favor during a daytime nativity or a daytime birth chart. And the basic reason for this is that Mars is said to become, already it's a fiery and hot planet, but it's said to become excessively hot and excessively fiery during the daytime. So if you're born during the daytime, you have a daytime chart, which means the sun was up in the sky when you were born, then you always have to be a little bit careful of Mars in your chart, because Mars can tend to be more excessively hot and fiery. And you can kind of imagine what an excessively fiery and hot Mars, god of war, might act like or behave like toward you or from you toward others or whatever. So it can be a little intense. Well, think about this. Our current president has Mars in Leo on the ascendant of his birth chart in a daytime chart. So he has the sun in the house of dreams, wishes, allies, friends, benefactors, very ambitious sun in Gemini in the 11th whole sign house. And then he has the Mars in Leo on the ascendant. The ascendant is like the steering wheel or the sort of rudder of your ship. And it tells us about the inherent intelligence of the native. So you have an excessively fiery and hot Mars in Leo, the sign of the king, on the ascendant, while you have a very wily Gemini sun in the 11th house of dreams and ambitions. This is someone who is not afraid to be duplicitous and bullying, in other words, in the way that they accomplish their ambitions in life, which they are constantly doing. And so anyway, that's just a simple example. I don't want to labor it too long here, but it's a simple example of how Leo has within it the capacity, depending on what planet is in Leo, to also behave like a tyrant, or to behave like someone who is a narcissist, or someone who mistakes the will and the the strong man type of mentality can be very Leonic, in fact. Now, it's of course interesting on a side note to mention that our current president also has a lunar eclipse coming up in his 7th house. This lunar eclipse will be in his 7th house, and that's the house of relationships and sexuality and love in ancient astrology to some extent. And so he's been getting eclipses in there for the past year and a half. He's also just had a loosing of the bond open up in the 7th house. I always remember that people like Al Capone was taken down, though he did massively heinous things, murdered people and stuff. He was taken down for tax evasion. It's very interesting to think that it could be a relationship or something illegal that he did related to a relationship that would possibly out him from his position. Now, I don't spend a lot of time with his chart. I don't spend a lot of time looking at his chart. But it is interesting to note that he has this loosing of the bond taking place in the seventh house since December of 2017, which lasts about 2 years up until the next election. The first loosing of the bond that he ever had that was of this magnitude was around the time that he first began changing his career interest to starting to inquire about a run for the presidency in the late 90s. Loosing of the bond periods in Hellenistic zodiacal releasing technique are related to a total change or transformation of focus or intention in your career. It's interesting that the last 2 years of his presidency, more or less, will be spent with what appears to be a significant change of direction professionally. Now, that could mean that he just loses the next election, or it could mean that he's taken from office or has to reconsider his career direction in a major way because of some scandal. But I don't think it's likely that he's our next president, and I think it's likely, based on the loosing of the bond, that he's in office as full term. Now, I could be just, projecting my own desires onto it, but at any rate, it'll be interesting to see what arises as this eclipse is coming into his seventh house. And he's had a lot of eclipses there, and he had one in his first house last year, and so the major solar eclipse on his basically near his ascendant. But the fact that he's having eclipses, this powerful eclipse with Mars retrograde in the seventh house, and that there were these tapes that were recently, Michael Cohen, his lawyer, has tapes of him talking about the payment that was made to this woman from his past and stuff like that, that's surfacing just as the next eclipse is rolling in, is all very fascinating. But to draw this all back to Leo, the point is that you can easily see within the Leo archetype, you can always easily see the relationship with its polar opposite sign of Aquarius, which often has to do with people who are cast out, who are cast down, who become outsiders rather than being at the center. And that's a Saturn function. And Saturn rules Aquarius. At any rate, so the fact that he has these eclipses lining up over there, that Saturn, the ruler of his seventh, is in the 12th house of imprisonment, conjoined with Venus, another planet related to love and sex and stuff like that, is all very fascinating. And it'll be interesting, again, to see how this plays out. So that's just a little that was a little tangent into our president's chart in the moment, in case anyone's interested. But back to Leo, you can hopefully see that within the themes of Leo, whether you're looking at the theme of pride and importance, self-importance, or the leaving of a legacy, of the idea of the king or the queen, all are related to the juxtaposition seasonally between a stable time of year, this middle of summer, and yet the inevitable decline, disintegration, loss of life. So how do you stabilize light within the midst of knowing that it will die someday? And that's really what, in a sense, the legacy of kings and rulers and nations with governing principles, like everyone's saying, oh, America's dying, right? So if America is dying, what do we mean by that? We mean that some kind of principle, some sort of transcendent principle that organizes, gives meaning and coherence to our existence as a nation is dying. That is the dark sun, in a sense. That is the shadow of Leo. And so I couldn't help but draw the connection to a president with a pretty nasty Mars in Leo right on his ascendant. So at any rate, those are some things to think about with Leo and why we say the things that we do about Leo. So you can now think about things like legacy, the death of the light, but sustaining something even though there will be the death of the light. All right, so the next thing that we want to talk about is, what does it mean that the sun is about to enter Leo and then square the planet Uranus right away, and then oppose Mars at the time of this upcoming lunar eclipse on the 27th? Well, here's some things that can happen. First of all, in a general sense, and I wrote about this, I don't know, yesterday or the day before, there's a lot of yang energy in the air with Mars, Uranus, and the sun all getting together in a tight T-square. So what does that mean in general? Well, yang is assertive, yang is creative, yang can be impatient and impulsive, yang can be reckless, and yang can be violent. Yang can be explosive, but yang can also be about things like bravery and courage and facing things and asserting something that needs to be asserted, making a choice that needs to be made. Whenever you have a T-square, you always have the look in a birth chart that looks like a crossroad. You have two planets opposing one another, and then a third sort of making a 90-degree angle to the two, so it looks like a T. Well, that when you come to the tip of the T, up the middle path, you get to a crossroads. Do I go left? Do I go right? And I think even just as an image that's sort of there in the chart, it's a helpful way of, the image grants us a helpful way of thinking about what a T-square represents. So when you have Sun, the planet that is related to things like clarity, knowledge, and authority or wisdom, but also fame and power and people in charge. And then you have Mars, will, aggression, bravery, courage, violence. And then you have Uranus, which is so much about defying the status quo, inventiveness, being, it's a kind of an eccentric planet. And it's disruptive, it is shocking. And you put all those things together, and you kind of have a little bit of a planetary stick of dynamite. You know what I mean? It really packs a yang punch. So one thing that we don't talk enough about in astrology is that one of the easiest ways to read a transit is not in terms of, well, what do these different planetary combinations mean, and then kind of trying to use that energy somehow to get something that you want. Another really important thing that it can grant to us is just saying, okay, so there's a theme of a lot of yang in the air. Where there's a lot of yang, there's the potential for something to be out of balance, for there to be too much yang. And so if that's what's coming through, in some ways, it's irrelevant what any of it means. The simplest thing is to counter with some yin, to just stay aware of, awake to the presence of yin. Softer, more receptive, patient, organic, natural, multifaceted, multidimensional, relational, spread out, waits for things to come to it rather than asserting itself. So, simple advice for the next week with all of this yang energy building toward the eclipse is just quite simply to counter with yin. Wherever you're getting overheated, overly amped up in your mind or body, in relationships, in work, and you're making choices that are fast, impulsive, reactionary, or impatient on any level, just notice it. The astrology is good to help you just simply notice it. We do have free will, so we can try to use our free will to just calm things down a little bit, and that's a great use of our free will. It's a great use of astrology. On the other hand, some things are destined. Some things are part of our karmic contract in life. And so the other thing to do is not to punish yourself or be hard on yourself or, gosh, what a failure of a yogi I am, or something like that. What a failure of a Zen master I am for getting amped up or getting a little, the sort of enthusiastic wave of yang energy comes through and you ride it, it's a little gnarly, you slip off, you crash a little here or there. That's okay too. Sometimes, there are certain things that are destined for us, certain events that will come in our surroundings or circumstances on the job or in our relationships, and they might force us to have a confrontation, or they might force us to get into some kind of power struggle, or we may have to assert ourselves in a way that's uncomfortable for us. And that may just be the path of destiny for you over the next week. So, but notice the difference. As these forces come through, and if you become captive to them as these, as this yang energy comes through, if you become taken over by it, and as you are, if you hear yourself saying, I should back off a little bit, I should slow down, I should think a little bit, I should pause, I should be a little bit more patient. If your inner voice is telling you that, and you lose the battle, just notice that means that there's still a victory that happened. Because the worst thing that could happen would be for you to get taken over by all of these energies coming through and to have no voice aware of it until after the fact, right? Until after the fact, then you say, okay, boy, I wish I wouldn't have done that, or boy, that got out of control, or something like that. Well, it's still good that you're able to take stock of what happened, and that's still a victory, spiritually speaking. You learned something good. But it's sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit for being in the fight internally, because we tend to privilege external things in the material world more than inner events. We think to ourselves, well, you know, I got into a fight with someone, or my boyfriend, or I got a little too assertive at work, or I like lost my cool, or just got impulsive or a little bit reckless, and you know, I was trying not to, but I did, and so fail. Wait a second, because what about the part where you were trying not to? That matters. That counts. You know, so we have to count our victories where they're actually happening, when they're actually happening, because even some advancement in terms of battling a little bit more inside with something that we know isn't healthy for us is a victory. It's a step in the right direction. Now, it wouldn't be good enough to keep counting it as a victory time and time and time again. So you're like, you know, internally you're like, you know, I know I shouldn't do it, but you know, like, well, no, you know, you should be in it and try to cut yourself off at the pass in the future so that you don't do it. But my point is to take note of progress where it's being made. So we're not encouraging like laziness, but we're also not suggesting being too punitive if we do get caught up in this week's events, because it's going to be intense. It's a lunar eclipse with the moon and Mars retrograde. It's easy to fly off the handle with this kind of thing. It's easy to be severe. It's easy to be reactive. It's going to be easy to make declarations that are just too much or too early, or you know, not carefully thought out enough, or whatever. The important thing is that remember, you do the best you can to try not to get taken over by these forces that the planets symbolize, but you also give yourself credit for doing your best, trying your hardest. There's a lot of, sometimes in the New Age world, you hear this thing like there is try, or there is no try. There's only do or not do, you know, and that's, you know, that's like super Yoda, right? And on a certain level, it's true. There is no try. There's do or don't do. But that's also sort of just BS. You know what I mean? Like, trying actually matters. I can tell you exactly why. Because if you try long enough and you don't give up, you will succeed. And that's also a value, you know? So whatever, all that New Age trope about there's no try, there's do or don't, I'll leave it for people who are interested in trying to manifest Ferraris all day long. Let them think that way. That's fine. I'll keep trying and seeing myself do well by continuing to try and fail. I'm fine with it. So at any rate, no, we're not saying that assertiveness is bad or yang is bad. Absolutely not. That would be incredibly shallow. What we're saying is that with the sun, Mars, and Uranus in a T-square during a lunar eclipse while Mars is retrograde, that there's the potential for the scales to be tipped too far in the direction of yang. And so compensating that with yin may be important right now. That's just sort of a simple teaching with this upcoming dynamic. There's others though, so hang in there. I've got more for you, I promise. So with this, you can also see Mars opposite the sun, challenges to authority. Uranus and Mars, defiance. You can see Uranus opposite the sun, challenges to the status quo or challenges to authority as well. You can also see the tendency to wield power or assertive Mars-like qualities in ways that are defiant, reckless, overly intense, hostile, etc. So some healthy challenges to convention, status quo, or authority that might need they may need to happen, or maybe constructive or positive in your life. You may need to challenge your own limitations or blockages. It's a good time to, like, you know, challenge yourself to do more than you think you can do, or to break through your own personal limitations or fears. That's all a great use of the yang energy, speaking to Melissa's concern that yang not be, you know, given its fair due. But again, you have to be careful, because this is this transit has the potential to be like, a meathead slamming Red Bull and snorting Coke. Like it just has the potential to be like just too much. So that's the first, like, the first major sort of beware of with this transit, is to be careful of that. but otherwise, healthy challenges to convention, authority, or the status quo could also be really good things right now. You have to know the difference in yourself. Here's one of the easy ways to know the difference, in my opinion. A lot of the times, the way that yang likes to justify itself is through sort of self-righteousness. Well, I know I'm right about this, so I can be forceful. Well, I know that it should be done, and so I can be too assertive. Well, I know that I'm right, and so it's okay if I get angry. And by angry, I don't mean like, intense or passionate. I mean like, the driver who has the right of way and will smash into your car, even if you're sort of innocently not paying attention. It's that kind of like, you get out of my way, I'm right, and my righteousness is fueling some sort of potential recklessness or violence. So you have to be very careful about it. We become something of the enemies we surround ourselves with. So it's also very important to remember that the entire one of the things that's really sort of in the air lately in society, especially with Neptune moving through the sign of Pisces, which has a lot to do with the roles of those who are victims or who are victimized, as well as victim complexes, those who are saviors as well as those with savior complexes, those who are martyrs as well as those who have martyr complexes. All of those kinds of themes are really prominent with Neptune moving through Pisces for a long, long period of time. When you throw that into the mix of the Pluto-Uranus square and the kind of moment, the zeitgeist, you often have people who believe that there is a war or a battle in the material world that can be finally won, a salvation, a victory, a completion, a sense of a righteous conclusion to things that can be won and should be won at any cost. And there is an absolutist way of thinking in this that is potentially very dangerous. And so there's one of the things we have to remember is that we become like our enemies when we engage with them in over a long period of time. This is something taught to us by Taoists and all sorts of mystics all across the planet. You become like your enemy the more that you spend time in the midst of your conflict with them, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And so we have to be careful of that right now, because it's a moment where we can become like our enemies. We can become like that which we oppose very, very easily. So there's a different way of winning. There's one of the ideas that I like for this transit is that there is a way of fighting that can be eclipsed. There is a way of facing challenges and confronting the problems in ourselves and in the world that itself can be changed and transformed. The paradigm of how we deal with conflict, how we try to make a wrong into a right or something like that, the entire paradigm of how and why we interact with that which we oppose has the potential to be transformed right now. So I'll just sort of say that out loud. Possibly too forceful or too much yang in the air. Attempts to kill, harm, or damage people in power, or conflicts with people in power. You have that from the sun as a source or center of power, a symbol for fame and rank and kings and rulers. And the Mars Uranus is the defiant attempt to thwart, kill, assassinate, go after, block out anything that we oppose, that we see as a source of power that we are envious of, that we're jealous of, that we think of as bad or cruel, or any or that we see as a false source of power or authority that needs to be challenged. So the desire to confront and possibly harm or damage someone or something that's in charge, that could be the extreme of the maybe more healthy side of challenging conventional power structures. So all of those things come in. And then again, the question I already went over was just how do we face what is thwarting us? We also have a theme, especially with Uranus and Mars and the sun together, which can be so illuminating and empowering and emboldening. It's a good quality for this combination. But you also have the illusion of the altar of progress. So what is the altar of progress? The altar of progress is a belief, really, a belief structure, a paradigm that we look at the world and we say, things are going to get better for me in the future. We can do this in simple ways. For example, on a very simple level, you might say that there's a habit that you want to have or one that you don't want to have. And you say to yourself, well, now I'm really bogged down by X, Y, and Z, and so I'll get to it in the future. Well, how do you know you'll get to it in the future? Well, because everything's going to be better in the future. Everything's going to be going and everything's going in the way that I want it to go. It's just there's some things between now and there that I got to kind of take care of first, right? So, and I know I do this all the time, right? The altar of progress societally is that, someday in the future, all of our problems will be solved, or someday in the future, all enemies will be vanquished, or someday in the future, we'll take care of global warming, and I don't want to, because I've got stuff I got to do right now, and eventually I'll start recycling, or I'll start, donating some money to a worthy cause, or I'll start being a part of a grassroots effort to do something in the world later. Because why? Because, well, things in the future will straighten out for me. But actually, we're like that societally. All of us participate in the same idea that things will just naturally, they'll get better in the future. Another part of the altar of progress is the belief that everything is becoming more conscious, more evolved, more sophisticated, more intelligent, more enlightened, and progressively things just go in that direction. Naturally, that's just where they go. And we think of this materially. We think of things like, well, society is becoming more enlightened, or we think of, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens in, well, first of all, just let me back up. Ancient astrologers, in the climate of the ancient world philosophically was not one that supported this idea. Whether we do now or not, you can consider for yourselves. But ancient astrologers had a general belief, for example, common in the East and West, among many different philosophical and religious schools, was the idea that time is cyclical. So in cyclical time, there are dark ages and there are light ages, and they cycle. They cycle round and round. So the wisdom of the sage is the one that knows that in the midst of the golden age, it's going to decline again. Corruption, morally, spiritually, materially, will come. And then on the other side of things, those who are in the dark age know that eventually things will look up. There will be a natural turn toward a return of virtuous qualities in the world, in civilization, etc. But the other thing you have to remember is that ancient astrologers essentially, especially from the Indian side of things, looked at the world and the dualities of light and dark as a part of the cycling of material nature that never ends. The universe is born and it goes through cycles like that until it's withdrawn back into the divine, and then it's sort of spewed forth again. And it's thought to be a realm that the soul comes into to do whatever it desires to do here in a sort of illusion experience of being separate from its source. So we go about all these different lives, moving through dark ages, light ages, etc., cycling like that, just following our desires. But they're all taking place more or less in a sort of ignorance or ignorance of our divine source. And that can go on as long as we want it to go on, because this realm is an eternal realm. It's a part of God's energy, and you can think of it like that. And yet its nature is to cycle through opposites. And it's said that when you are from the enlightened perspective, for example, it's said that these opposites within the spiritual realm are reconciled. They're not battling with each other. We're not torn apart by them. We don't go through the kinds of tumultuous cyclings that we do here. That's just so if you can think that that's the paradigm in the ancient world, right? Then, all of the people who are excited about technology and breakthroughs in technology, liberating the human spirit, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine just a moment that this current age that we're in is actually thought of for example, in the Indian tradition as a dark age. So in other words, just try on for size the idea that right now we're not living in an age of progress. We're actually living in an age of entropy and decline. And one of the symptoms of the age of entropy and decline is the belief that everything is evolving to make us better and stronger and more beautiful and live longer and be, more enlightened, et cetera, but all taking place within a material conception. So that's sort of the view of the Kali Yuga from the sort of Indian cosmology standpoint that we're thought to be living in right now. So one of the things I find refreshing about this perspective, and I'll tie this back to Uranus and the eclipse and everything in a moment. One of the things that I find really refreshing about this perspective is that it's not overly impressed by the idea of the future becoming a better and better place. It doesn't allow the ego to get lost in that trip. So in other words, we put all of our stock in, I'm going to be happier someday in the future. The world's going to be a better place someday in the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's actually a symptom, you could say, of being in a dark age. When you're in a dark age, that you kind of think, well, everything's going to get better in the future. Everything is moving in a better direction. It's actually a symptom of being in a dark age. And then remember that even if you get to a light age, it'll become dark again. What does that perspective do to the mind? And how do you start thinking then about progress? What is real progress from that perspective? Spiritually speaking, progress may look like something completely different than the way that we think about progress in the material world. Now, I realize that may sound like a sort of incredulous thing to say, especially in some ways, the more that you are dealing with very basic survival needs in the world, right? Like, if you're just struggling to be treated fairly in society, if you're just struggling to put food on the table, pay your bills, have some sense of human dignity, it's very hard to zoom out to the sort of cosmic perspective. And yet, I don't believe that it is a perspective that is, it comes from that perspective comes from people whose vows were to lives of simplicity and lives that were specifically not enamored by the pursuit of material goods for the sake of happiness. So at any rate, those are things to think about. Why? Because when you get to Uranus, Mars, and the Sun, it's also very easy to become amped up about something that you believe will bring you progress. Well, this is going to give me progress. Well, this is going to take me further. So you start coming up with a very inventive new way of being or thinking or doing, and you get really, jacked up about it under this transit, right? The point is just we should all be very careful of the illusion of progress in the material world, because it's temporary. All progress eventually devolves. All evolution eventually de-evolves. That's a belief that ancient astrologers had, that time was cyclical. So be careful of the Uranus, Mars, Sun dynamic coming through, and the temptation to go and worship at the altar of the future and of progress. That doesn't mean, of course, that we can't be passionate about advocating for important changes and progress in the material world. It's just this kind of transit can take you over and can possess you. And ultimately, when we become blind in the grips of progress, the eventual decline of whatever it is that we think is so progressive and will grant us so much excitement devolves, and then it's very, very painful. Or another thing that happens is that when the cause that we're fighting for, that we think is so progressive, when it runs out of steam, we will simply, like someone who starts by smoking 2 cigarettes a day and eventually goes up to a pack, we will start needing more and more intense conviction moving in the direction of progress. It's just the same thing in any kind of addictive tendency. If you believe that progress will give you your happiness outside of the current moment that you're in, and it's future oriented, you will, after the energy behind your current cause runs out, you'll need a new one. And it will start to possess you, and people won't want to be around you. And and then you'll get angry, and you'll think everyone is against you, and no one is really as progressive as I am, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's how it takes people over. And then everyone is viewed as not nearly progressive enough or not nearly forward thinking enough. These are destructive things to believe, and they set one apart from others. And then we end up feeling like everyone is against us, and that's not the case. But look at our world right now. Look at our political situation, right? From up, and I'm not saying look at it, I'm just saying, like, look at it from the astrological perspective. If you want to get into astrology and you're hoping the astrology will just confirmation bias your feelings about politics, you're not studying ancient mystical astrology, in my opinion. But if you zoom out, if you look at the political landscape from 10,000 feet right now, people are diehard believing that their story about this country is progressive on both sides, with equal anger and vitriol toward one another. And ancient astrology, you're talking about Stoics, you're talking about Platonists, you're talking about yogis, you're talking about Buddhists. They're not without their feelings about what is virtuous and what is evil, but they are also not so sort of mindless as to not recognize the ironic way in which you can become sucked into the polarity and you can become like your enemy. And so you don't see ancient Stoic type of thinkers, ancient yogic moksha oriented philosophers sitting around talking for the most part about a sort of progressive political agenda of any kind. And so there's just something there for all of us to consider with this particular transit coming up. Just take note of how the obsession with being progressive itself is a sort of symptom of not being in your seat. And so what does it look like to be progressive without being attached to your idea of yourself as progressive? That goes for me. That goes for all of us. That's a really deep, hard lesson with this transit. Now, some people, I've had good debates and arguments with friends, family about this kind of thing. And some people, the immediate criticism is something like, well, you're, like, I don't feel like what you're doing is really that radical. And what you're saying here seems like it's encouraging of passivity, right? They'll hear that. And all I can say is this, that if you can understand that the material realm is not the only realm, it's not the primary realm, and in fact, it's ephemeral and fleeting. If you believe that, then the radical form of action, the definition of radical progressive actions in the world becomes something different. I'm not about to back down from that position just because someone out there, to me, doesn't have the insight to see that it's not a passive position. So there is a weird way in which you do have to be assertive about spiritual values as well. But the spiritual, when you look at compassion and you look at the way that these different mystical traditions have talked about being a warrior in the world, or working in the world for the sake of material progress, there is a very deep level of disillusionment that with the entire thing that accompanies whatever actions a person takes. And I believe that is far more radical than getting lost in the illusion of material progress, which is essentially, as impermanent as the fact that our whole solar system will someday die. So I think it's important to say that about polarities at this moment. And I've been feeling more and more with the energies of this transit rising that this is a good message to also assert. We're talking about assertiveness and challenge to paradigms. So at any rate, okay. So those are some of the messages that I had for today. We're getting to the last point in my list here, which is full moon lunar eclipse. So what does it mean that you're adding into this, though, this big lunar eclipse? Like, what is that all about? Full moon lunar eclipse adds the feeling of fate. It adds the feeling of destiny. It adds the full moon moment of a powerful culmination, a peak moment. It's a moment where there is something that is ending, something that is closing, something that is being eclipsed, something that is being, a shadow is being cast over something, a darkening. So it adds a heavier feeling to the whole thing, a culminating feeling, and also a sort of fated feeling. So watch what happens over the next week. I think it'll be really interesting. Now, hopefully I've done something that I like to do, which is whenever, as an astrologer, for those of you who are out there who are astrologers and astrology students, whenever I give talks about different kinds of intense transits, one thing that I try to do is embody, okay, what's the benefit of this transit? Like, like asserting or confronting something, like asserting yourself in a constructive way or confronting something. There's a positive thing you could gain from this transit. What's a negative one? Possibly being too forceful or too much yang in the air. And then also in every time that I do one of these talks, I try to also speak to something spiritual, something that I feel is of spiritual value to us as astrologers. And to me, there is not just one spiritual message to the transits, right? There are a plethora of possible spiritual messages, but I would encourage all of you to find one for yourself. You may not resonate with the messages that I bring through on every occasion, but that doesn't mean that you can't work with the archetypes that I've mentioned and drawn out within a talk and then say, here's how I see it being applied in my immediate environment. There's some very specific lesson here that is deepening my sense of being an eternal spirit soul that's helping me to be more in the moment. And you have the unique eyes for that within your life situation. The gift of learning astrology, the gift of the language of astrology, is to take all of these concepts that are sort of swimming around in an astrological talk and keep them with you, keep them in a journal, in your backpack, keep them close at hand so that you can become the hermeneutic interpreter, so that you can become the linguist who sees the symbols active and alive in the language of your life. So I hope that you'll all do that, because, I always, whenever I get really passionate about something, I get up on my soapbox about something, I always think it's really important to remind people of their freedom to become equally passionate about what the divine is showing you in your own lives. So at any rate, I hope that this has been constructive for everybody today, and that you've learned something new, and that you have some excitement and you have a sense of what to watch for in the next week as these energies perfect. I'm going to take a look at questions now, and then we'll be done. Okay. Let's see. Someone said holy wars. Yes. Yeah, exactly. If a person is mentally ill or sees what is distressing as satisfying or chaotic as peaceful, or damaging as progressing, as the dark light, so to speak, how to interpret a loosing of the bonds or anything else? Yes. I'm going to dare to say that the language, the original sort of traditional language of astrology, has a kind of moral component built into it. For example, Trump's loosing of the bond is happening in Aquarius from Leo, meaning the times are handing over from a Leo period, sun ruled, to a Saturn period. And that often, not always, but often will mean, depending on the condition maybe of Saturn in the birth chart, will often tell you if what is going to happen will be an increase in and I'm talking about the material world now, an increase in subjectively agreed upon evil or subjectively agreed upon good. Just general terms like punching a child in the face is evil, and giving someone a nice back massage when they're stressed out is kind. You know what I mean? Like just consensus reality stuff. The birth chart will often tell you. So Trump's loosing of the bond, handing the times over to Saturn, and Saturn being in his 12th house of self-undoing, the house that was traditionally called the evil spirit, and that was the joy of Saturn, and it's conjoined with Venus. I would go more toward Trump's self-destructive pattern at that point. He just had he has the fixed star Procyon really close to his Saturn-Venus conjunction, and when the eclipse was just on that, he totally put in his foot in his mouth with regard to the whole meeting in Helsinki with Putin. The star Procyon is known for intemperate speech, like problems being like verbally combative and getting yourself into trouble. So he had that happen in the 12th house of self-undoing with an eclipse on those planets. Like generally speaking, the virtue of ancient astrology is that it can tell you very clearly what kinds of things are going to happen. The stuff in that house, not going to be so good for the most part. Sometimes in a person's in a 12th house, you might see that as something that's a little bit more saintly or compassionate, or some kind of desire for healing or something like that. But the 12th house is only related to those things insofar as it's related to darkness. There's no you can't whitewash the 12th house like we try to do in New Age modern astrology. In ancient astrology, it's just very clear that the 12th house is a place of suffering. However, it's also very clear that there's a role for suffering within the life of a mystic. And it's that kind of context that you can often use to understand how it's going to play out for a person. Those forces are greater than Trump's perception of good and evil. Do you know what I mean? That's the whole point that I would make there. So whatever his perceptions of good and evil might be, it doesn't matter. If he has a 12th house event happening, the likely thing that's going to happen, especially knowing a little bit of what we know about him and his history already, we could probably say that the eclipse in this house is going to highlight these kind of things. The loosing of the bond with Saturn taking over and Saturn taking us into 12th isn't good for him in terms of what he would want with his life subjectively. Not going to turn out so well, probably. Just basic stuff there. Thank you. Very good question. Lisa says, Adam, thank you for saying this about polarities. I couldn't agree more. It's a challenge. It is a challenge completely detached in disillusionment. Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about numbness, and we're not talking about turning a blind eye to suffering, but we also, there's a lot of isms out there, right? There's a lot of isms, and most of the isms out there can become a platform for our ego, and can keep us just as stuck in the wheel of reincarnation as anything else, and can keep us from turning our hearts to the divine. Which is a moment-by-moment activity, and when we start doing it moment by moment, our orientation in time is toward eternity, not toward the past, not toward the future, not even toward the present in juxtaposition to the future or the past. That actually has the ability to grant us a kind of immunity from karma. So it's talked about that, for example, in Bhakti, it's talked about you develop this kind of connection to God in your heart, and you start walking through the world in a sense immune to the ups and downs of fortune. You still have a destiny to live, you still have people to help, good deeds to do, etc. But that's not what defines you. That's not what makes your life, and that's not your goal. That's not the goal of your life. It's not what you're attached to. Because the idea is that even if conditions were to severely deteriorate, this kind of spirituality would allow you to still have the exact same kind of access to the eternal in your heart at any time. That's sort of the heart of the belief there. Okay, anyway, doesn't a real warrior prefer not to fight but will if necessary? I guess so. I don't know, because I'm not a real warrior. I mean, I don't consider myself one anyway, so I don't know. But I suppose even Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is reluctant to fight because the context of the fight is just, it's civil war. No one wants to fight in a civil war. But he's told that he has to. He's also just told not to not to get attached to fighting while he's fighting, which is a weird thing to think about. Okay. Thank you for saying the truth in public. Is there a schedule of when you speak? I just happen to be online sometimes when you're live. No, I just kind of, when I have time, my schedule's pretty erratic. I thank you so much for watching. I'm glad that you do. You can check out my YouTube channel because I always post the replays of my talks on the YouTube channel. So you could always, if you miss it, you can always just subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll get a notification whenever I post something new if you can't see me live. He seems to have avoided many of the repercussions that could be expected to happen to the average person. Maybe. You're right in terms of like externally, he seems to have gotten away with a lot. Like he seems sort of slippery or something like that. Not surprising though for a Gemini sun in some ways, right? In the 11th house, which is a house of, was called the house of good spirit and is subjectively connected to having friends and allies and benefactors and sort of good fortune in life. And not a total surprise that he also has Mars on the ascendant and is like, he's bullied his way into a lot of things in this world. Unfortunately, in this age, this sort of dark, I would say sort of dark age, might makes right. That's shitty, it's unfortunate, but that's a clearly, just look at the news and clearly that is a reality. In a large part of the world, that's a reality. And it's something we have to be we have to fight against, but it's also something that helps to fight against if you level with it right in the beginning and just say that's what it is. So people often get away with something because they can because they're willful and they get really good at it. Like a person who lifts a lot of weights can throw their weight around easier. People can do that. There are karmic repercussions though, and we don't know what kind of inner life the man leads. It'd be very easy to speculate not much of one, right? But all sorts of people in the world who appear to be very strong and sure of themselves and cocky are eaten inside by the maggots of self-doubt and fear and self-loathing and self-criticism, and they're fighting that and strong-arming those voices just as much as they're strong-arming everything else in the world, and they'll never tell a darn person that's actually what's going on inside because that's how stubborn they are. That's a form of that can be brutal. We don't know. I extend some imagination to enemies because it's also even recommended in things like the Art of War to try to understand the things that the weaknesses of your enemies. You have to understand their strengths, and as much as it kills us to imagine the strengths of a person like Donald Trump because it's so clear that we don't like his behavior. Trying to imagine his strengths helps us to imagine where he may be suffering on the inside and where the weaknesses might be and things like that. And of course, that helps us in knowing how to exploit certain things. People have been doing that in the media for a while now. Unfortunately, it hasn't resulted in as much as we'd all probably like to see, but there are ways of understanding what opponents' insecurities are and everything like that. And just think to yourself, how in your relative world, in any of our relative worlds, how much your own insecurities eat at you. Like I know mine do, and what a battle it is to just deal with them, deny them, repress them, try to deal with them, try to heal them, try to face them. And just think of how much those insecurities are festering in a person's life who is not trying to do any healing work on them or who is completely trying to deny or avoid them. That makes them grow stronger. So you can only imagine that a person like that is slowly, their sanity is leaving them. And they will soon be in the presence of demonic forces in their mind and in their life. And so we have to have compassion for that. We have to have that level of compassion. Even if we're fighting somebody, we still have to have that level of compassion. So, Ra says, Aaron says, happy second baby soon. Thank you. Any day now. we're like every day is like contractions. Okay. No, they're going away. Okay, shoot. But it's exciting. Ross says, Trump is an instrument of collective forces and has that laid on his personal destiny. Yeah, it's important the way that some people's karma, I mean, I believe personally, I believe that it's still a result of their own personal choices over time. I think most of the time, destiny doesn't select somebody for a powerful role in the collective unless they've been gunning for it on a certain level. But I do hear what you're saying, and I believe that yeah, there's he in a way you can think about him. I'm just talking off the top of my head, or it's my opinion, but in a way you can think of him as representing a huge like section of like willfully, ignorant people, but not just people, because it's more complex than that, because nobody is just a singular entity. We are many, even within ourselves, right? So, but he speaks to something in people, in many people, that are angry, that are lazy, that are, whatever, all of the things. It's like every bad form of sarcastic comedy and reality television show from the 20 years combined with like a Big Mac and a hair dye is like all just, jammed into one. So it's like that. But then for me, the important exercise, that part's easy. That part's like writing an Onion article. It's fun to be satirical because our enemies are easy targets. But for me, it's very difficult to imagine in the opposite direction why there is such willful ignorance. Where does it come from? How does it exist? And to look at how I'm implicated in it. To me, that is the far more radical thing to do. For example, when I reflect on my attitude during the Barack Obama years, and I think about how many times in public, unknowingly, I might have bragged about how progressive and enlightened and how we were becoming, or how, thank God we're getting, it's like the diminishment of like trashy, closed-minded, conservative, like rednecks or something. Like, just imagine any time over those 8 years where I might have spoken of my imagined opposition, right, in terms that were really pejorative and nasty and self-righteous, right? And even if I have some kind of moral high ground, that I know that the unconscious attitude of a person who is in the victor's seat for long enough, it tends to enrage one's opponent, and the opponent never dies. It never goes away in the material realm. It rises up even in people who are the unsuspecting vessels for those kinds of feelings or sentiments. Like, I have people in my family who I would never peg as Trump people, who are embodying some of his rhetoric and anger and whatever, only because there is latent frustration in them with snobbish, elitist, highly educated leftists, right? And I'm not talking about the nice left people that I think of. I'm talking about there are jerks on both the left and the right. And the point is that there's something also within the whole Trump thing that has captured people's rage against a certain kind of, it's not just rage against truly good moral things. It's not like they're just total ignorant bigots. I mean, all of the bigotry is there and it's ignorant, but there's also a way in which the self-righteousness of the quote unquote liberal culture is fairly satirized by people and is in itself provoking. And so it's just, I always try to take at least a moment to enter into some sympathy with how my opponents might feel. Try to go into that space just a little bit, because granting someone humanity goes a lot. When you grant them humanity, when you extend them empathy, when it comes to the next confrontation you have personally outside of social media, where you can be guarded in all of our judgments about people and our rightness about things, when you have a real encounter with someone who feels opposite the way you do, and you've taken time to try to imagine how they might feel, try to empathize with how they might feel, in that position, when you're actually face to face with them, you will have more empathy and more will get done to bring them closer to you as well. And so if we want to get things done in the world, that's the way we have to do it. And in my opinion, that's, and one of the reasons I stay out of the political thing in general is because I believe that practice is fundamentally more radical, and I just, that's it. I see that the more we hammer on how bad this sort of alt-right, far-right stuff is, I think the more we empower it. Even though I don't like it, even though I do personally think that there is too much racism, too much bigotry, et cetera, I just think we have to be very careful with tone and mood and intent with how we try to make things better in the world. That's my personal opinion. People obviously disagree with me. I still would want to be, I would still want to be friends. So anyway. So we've gone way over today with lots of questions though. So this is interesting. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in. This has been a fun conversation. You can already feel it. Like I can already feel in myself the T-square like coming in. It's like, oh, I'm all like, oh, we got to do this. And I'm all passionate about all this stuff. It's like, you know, I'm going to go take a dose of yin after today. Okay, guys, have a beautiful day. I hope that you enjoy these energies, and we'll touch base again in the next, probably early next week. Bye.